predicted Scotland would become the epicentre of the UK's gender debate. Did you have that on your bingo card? It is almost 6 months exactly since Nicola Sturgeon resigned as First Minister, citing a long-term assessment of her role. But shortly before an investigation was announced into SNP finances, that's the party she was with, and shortly after, she said this.
Are all trans women women? You haven't answered that question.
Well, that's not the point that we're dealing with here.
That's the question I'm asking.
Trans women are women, but in the prison context, there is no automatic right for a trans woman.
So there are contexts where a trans woman is not a woman?
No, there is circumstances in which a trans woman will be housed in the male prison estate.
Now, she did say it wasn't those sort of short-term pressures around those comments that caused her to quit, but the SNP had been pushing legislation to allow Scottish people to change their legal sex from man to woman or woman to man simply by signing a declaration. But ultimately, that move was blocked by Westminster. And now, another SNP MP has come out on the attack on behalf of the trans movement. Mhairi Black, she was once Britain's youngest MP in 350 years when she was first elected aged 20. She has been slamming people who intellectually criticise the extension of trans rights in society, saying they're bad actors, radicalising people online, and get this, she described them as 50-year-old Karens. Do you know what she means by that? A lot of you apparently do, because the word Karen was actually trending across X or Twitter or whatever you call it, social media in the UK today off the back of all this. The idea of a Karen, I will remind you if you don't know, it stems from an internet meme showing a white middle-aged woman who demands to speak to the manager. The suggestion is that Karen is a closed-minded and overly privileged woman who abuses her privileges to get her demands met. Now, you can understand, then, why many self-described middle-aged women with opinions on gender matters took offence at that comment. Some pointing out that one day, 28-year-old Mhairi Black herself will be a 50-year-old white woman. Something I can agree with Black on, though, is this response she gave when she was asked at this event. She was speaking at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and she was saying all this stuff. She was asked what makes a decent person. And she said, to me, a decent person is someone who tries to make others comfortable and accept them, particularly when it's a marginalised, oppressed group. That's just human progress. And to me, being decent is being part of that progress, not hindering it. Now, definitely see the point she's trying to make there. But what if she extended that logic to the many women she offended with her words? You can't preach peace and then declare war. With her name-calling and insults, Mhairi Black is feeding into the toxic public discourse she says she's against. But that is free speech, isn't it? If you really, really believe in intellectual debate and free speech, you have to hear it from all sides. So short of everyone staying decent, which we're a bit far past at this point, especially on this show, then no one should try to shut Mhairi Black down for what she said today about Karens and bad actors, as much as Mhairi Black shouldn't try to shut down others for the views they express different to her own. A right to be offended? Yes, of course, everyone's got that right. But freedom of expression and debate should never come at the expense of that. Joining me to debate all of this, TalkTV contributor Esther Krakow in the studio and former Labour Special Advisor and co-founder of the left-wing campaign group Momentum, James Schneider. Also joining us from New York is the former Conservative MP, Louise Mensch. Thank you both, well, three of you, all of you, for making time this evening. James, I will come to you first on this, if you don't mind, and just talk a little bit about those comments made by Mhairi Black. Do you think it's all right for her to compare what she essentially said was gender critics, so people who are against the idea of extending trans rights in society? She said the people who are intellectually debating that are akin to people who made same claims about race, so sort of almost saying there's a sort of supremacy thing going on here, almost akin to fascists. She didn't say those words directly, but that's the comparison that's been made, the Telegraph headlining that today. Do you think it's okay for her to make those comparisons?
Well, what she said, or what she seems to have said, is that the media and politicians should leave trans people the hell alone, I think was her quote. And in that, of course, she's right. In that quote you read out about being decent, there's this small, very small group in society that is marginalised and that is vulnerable and that is politically attacked again and again and attacked in the media again and again with scare stories and falsehoods. But what I'm interested in is not that itself. I think, trans people should be protected and their rights should be protected and so on and so forth. But why is it that that's happening? Why has it become such a major issue in the media and in politics when It's a very marginal issue. It affects a very small number of people. And if you look at all of the polling over recent years, not that many people care that much about it. And I think the reason why it's become such a major political issue is to divide us, because for the overwhelming majority of people, life is harder than it was 10, 15 years ago. And so rather than the media and politics discussing how we can boost our pay, how we can reduce our mortgages in our rent, how we can reduce our bills, how we can finally tax the super rich to pay for our public services, we're having these kind of ridiculous culture war arguments which are super marginal. And actually, probably, if we had Mhairi Black here, the way in which she would say it would probably be quite decent and reasonable, and the person criticising her would probably be quite decent and reasonable, and there wouldn't be such a fundamental row.
But she didn't, she made those points, but at the same time, Esther, bringing you into this conversation, do you think the words that she chose fed into her line about being decent?
Well, not really. The thing is, one of the things that she said that I found interesting was she said these people trying to intellectualize the debate around trans rights, which I don't understand what the problem is. You certainly want intellectual debates on an issue. What is it? Do you want policy to be created on the back of anti-intellectual debates? That's ludicrous. Anyway, but she said a lot of the people that fund these groups that are critical of gender ideology are far-right groups based in the US that are mainly sort of fundamentalist Christians, for instance.
She said, yeah, conservative or Christian funded.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really not touching on the issue, because at the end of the day, many groups are funded in many different ways. You can extend that argument to many things. I think one of the problems we have here is, I understand the point that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, there are only like 10 trans people in the UK, really. And so I understand what your point about it's a bit of a distraction. But I think that is the trap that Labour has fallen into, because people like Keir Starmer don't seem to understand the magnitude of the issue, not because there are so many trans people that it affects every single person in the UK, but because when women, biological women, feel like politicians aren't taking these issues seriously, when, you know, issues, real issues like, you know, female shelters, women's sports, women's prisons, when they come into the debate, when you try and trivialize it and say, actually, this is a red herring, that's when people get really irate. What most people want is just clarification on the law. I completely agree. Let trans people do what they want, let them live their lives. But when it comes to public policy and actual legal clarifications on these matters, that's when it really, you know, it really stings, because that's what most people are concerned with. Most people don't think about trans people in their day-to-day lives. Excuse me, most people have never even met a trans person. But when you're talking about the law and the definition of male and female and what the implications that has for, you know, female prisons and shelters and all of that, that's when you need to take it seriously. And I think we need to be very careful about trivializing that.
Well, and the legislation is what led to a lot of this debate within the SNP party and what Scotland was trying to get done. Now, let's cross over to Louise Mensch in New York, standing by listening to this. A Brit overseas, so you come at this with an interesting perspective. And well, first of all, can I say the producers, Louise, let me know that you are, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, above the age of 50, which I was actually quite shocked by, because I thought you were quite a bit younger. How do you feel about that wording that Mhairi Black used then to describe the group that you belong to, a white woman in her 50s?
Well, you're so flattering. Maybe you should be the politician, Rosanna. I actually think that it's ageist. And for somebody that considers herself to be a progressive politician, coming out and dismissing an entire class of women because of their age doesn't seem to me to be very forward-thinking at all. It's not just ageist, it's also sexist, of course. There is no male Karen equivalent. It's just something that's flung at middle-aged women. And she is obviously totally wrong. Half of the strongest so-called gender critical, I would call them gender realist, critics of extremist trans ideology are lesbians, they're black women, they're Muslim women, they come from all sections of society. J.K. Rowling, who's one of the most prominent of these opponents, lives in Scotland and of course has been a Labour Party supporter all her life. So I think what she's saying is what she wishes was true, not what's actually true. There's a consensus in society, I think, about the trans issue. Most people think you should be polite and you should address people how they want to be addressed. But we also recognise that you cannot change your biological sex. And if people would just agree to that consensus. You can't change your biological sex, and some spaces should be reserved for people who are biologically women. This whole row would go away.
I think, to be fair to the Labour MP in question here, she is 28.
SNP Scotland.
Sorry, SNP. It's been a long day. She is 28. She's only a year older than me. Unfortunately, we're part of that generation that uses those terms. I'm not saying it was particularly wise for her to use that term, but I understand what she's trying to say, because on the online speak context, a Karen is just, you know, and I understand it seems sexist and all of that, but I don't think it's as egregious as it's being made out to be. I think she just, you know, misspoke. I think it was if she was probably in a more professional setting, she would have chosen her words more carefully. But I think the overarching issue here is the legality of, you know, male and female, how that affects, you know, women in public spaces, for instance, and all of that. That's really the crux of the issue, not whether trans people are being allowed to live their lives or whether people care about what you identify as on Tuesday, on Thursday, or whatever.
What I'm getting from this, actually, between the three of you, is quite a lot of consensus here, that people do understand that it's actually a minority group issue. People would rather trans people were allowed to get on with their lives and everyone else would as well. But what happens is we do have this toxic narrative around it. James, you were explaining first why you think that is the case and why this has got somewhat out of hand. In that sense, then, how do you de-escalate it? Do you think we need, because the risk here is that you stymie intellectual debate if you say we just need to all shut up about it. But then, as Esther pointed out, laws get passed and people think, I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware that now so and so can use this changing room or that bathroom, and then they get quite concerned. Do you think there is still a cause for this intellectual debate to happen about trans rights?
Well, if there were going to be a sensible debate that, for example, accepted that sex is in the Equality Act, that there's a difference between sex and gender, that's already in the law, and what we're talking about is marginal cases, but that isn't what happens. You know, the people who are most bellowing about female prisons are, of course, not long-standing members of the Howard League for Penal Reform. They're people that, generally speaking, don't care about prisoners the rest of the time, but it's helping them make this particular argument. So, I mean, of course, you could have a sensible debate. You could have a serious discussion about it. That isn't how our politics and media is set up, because it's a distraction.
Yes, the average person may not be particularly concerned with the conditions of prisoners in prisons, but they understand that these kinds of things can trickle down into their own lives. So, for instance, today it's having a male rapist in a female prison. Tomorrow, you could have a male that's entitled to share a female bathroom with your teenage daughter. There are real-world implications. I don't think it's fair to just say you must, you know, dedicate your life to this particular cause, to care about that. Actually, and this is the point that women have been making, and I'm not trying to say because you're a man you don't understand it, but again, this is why it's important to not trivialize their concerns and, you know, use such callous language as this MP has, because you're stepping on a lot of people's toes.
I'm not trivializing the concerns, but what I'm saying is, when you see the headlines like the one on the Telegraph, which is not a quote, it's a scare thing. It's meant to generate a negative reaction. It's meant to make this debate more and more toxic, and attach more and more division. The purpose of that, from the Telegraph and from most of the media, which is owned by billionaires, is to make us divided and not allow us to talk about things like how do we increase our pay and how would we tax the rich, because that isn't in the interests of most politicians and most of the media.
I want to go back to Louise before we run out of time and just say that some in the political circles were calling Louise on Mhairi Black to not only stand down, which I think she's planning on doing, but they're saying she was unfit for office off the back of these comments, that she doesn't have the intellectual capacity to carry forward legislation as needed by an MP. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree that she doesn't have the intellectual capacity. She seems like a very bright young woman, but I do agree that she isn't fit for office because she is willing to castigate and categorise an entire group of people that don't agree with her. And as we all know, after the row about the trans rapist in the women's prison, most of Scotland doesn't agree with her. So perhaps it's a good thing that she's stepping down. I don't completely agree with the idea that this is just a controversy that's being created. It is a real controversy. People care about it. I care about women's sportswomen not getting gold medals because men are competing in their categories. I especially care about gender so-called affirming surgeries being done on minors who can't consent to a beer in the United States, for example. They can't vote, they can't have sex, but somehow they can alter their bodies forever in ways that they're clearly not mature enough to do. So I think we do, like Esther says, we need some clarifications from Westminster government as to what the law should be. And if the law was clearly defined, then all of this would go away.
Louise, Esther, James, thank you all for joining this conversation this evening. It's been fascinating.